I mean, what did you make of Mark Carney's speech? He really called on smaller countries to band together against great powers. People say this is one that's going to go down in the history books.
It's the best speech he ever gave, and I know him, from his time as the governor of the Bank of England. It's the best speech he ever gave, and he was, the one thing that he said, which is true, he said, this is a rupture. This is not something where it will never be like it was before. But I would say this is not just about Donald Trump. The so-called global north has 1 billion people. The so-called global south has 7 billion people. So, the center of gravity is going to shift away from Europe, and it's going to shift away from many of the powers that he called middle powers. China, I wouldn't call a fellow middle power. It's also a great power.
Cornelia Meyer, welcome to Visionary. Now, do you think that Davos 2026 really marked a return to relevance?
Well, actually, I always considered Davos relevant because you got many of the key players in industry and in politics congregated for 1 week, locked up on a mountain. And that had great dynamics. And if you spoke to, let's say, the CEO of a big insurance company and you said, well, it's very expensive. He said, going to Davos spares me at least 4 months of traveling because I can see everybody. So for industry, for business, it always had a relevance. And I think for politics, it always had a relevance. But this time, with Donald J. Trump, everything just becomes exacerbated and bigger and larger than life. So this time it was larger than life. It was the Trump Davos, but others like Mark Carney held against. So it was a very interesting dynamic.
You cannot live within the lie of mutual benefit through integration when integration becomes the source of your subordination. The multilateral institutions on which the middle powers have relied, the WTO, the UN, the COP, the very architecture of collective problem solving are under threat. And as a result, many countries are drawing the same conclusions, that they must develop greater strategic autonomy in energy, food, critical minerals, in finance and supply chains. And this impulse is understandable. A country that can't feed itself, fuel itself, or defend itself has few options. When the rules no longer protect you, you must protect yourself. But let's be clear-eyed about where this leads. A world of fortresses will be poorer, more fragile, and less sustainable.
I mean, what did you make of Mark Carney's speech? He really called on smaller countries to band together against great powers. People say this is one that's going to go down in the history books.
It's the best speech he ever gave, and I know him, from his time as the governor of the Bank of England. It's the best speech he ever gave, and he was, the one thing that he said, which is true, he said, this is a rupture. This is not something where it will never be like it was before. But I would say this is not just about Donald Trump. It's also about demography, right? The U.S. is both a Pacific and an Atlantic power. And if I look at the so-called global north has 1 billion people, the so-called global south has 7 billion people. So, the center of gravity is going to shift away from Europe, and it's going to shift away from many of the powers that he called middle powers. But then there are also Asian middle powers. There are also African middle powers, but they're not bound in yet in the way that the OECD framework allows us to be bound in.
I mean, absolutely. That speech was received differently wherever you happen to be globally. And it did seem to land very differently in Washington compared to Davos. How would you unpick that?
Well, I would say in Washington, obviously, it was seen differently because let's not forget, Canada is the largest trading partner of the U.S. So this is very important. And Carney was sort of, he was not divorcing himself from the US, but he was pleading for less integration, for, more self-help, so to speak. So that was different. And Canada is important. If you look at manufacturing, if you look at natural resources, 60% of US oil imports hail from Canada. Canada has metals and minerals. Canada has it all, has everything that the US needs. Now, and also agriculture, he's very, very clear on the US was going against the dairy, and he was speaking in his speech at some part in French, and that was addressing the dairy industry in Quebec. In other words, so Canada is relevant, and Canada is divorcing itself. It's going on a sort of a multi-vectoral approach, and again, it won't come back. And when he says we need to have trade agreements with many countries, that's great. But frankly, China, I wouldn't call a fellow middle power. It's also a great power.
I wonder if you think there was a contradiction between Christine Lagarde distancing herself from Carney while walking out on Howard Lutnick.
Well, I think she was right to walk out on Howard Lutnick because he was just a bit too much. And yes, she had to distance herself from Carney because her mandate is the ECB, and so she has to do what's right for the ECB. And Carney was maybe just a wee bit too aggressive. So and central bankers are never as aggressive as politicians, right? Central bankers are cautious people. I once congratulated a central banker for being such a terribly boring man. And he said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, you need to be boring. You're a central banker. It's good to be boring."
Do you think that the global economy has been drifting towards nationalism for longer than we admit?
I think it has been drifting towards nationalism. I think that this global framework that, let us not forget, was created by the United States. The WTO and the UN and all these frameworks were created by the United States after the Second World War. And yes, you see it not just in the US, you see it in the UK. We have the Reform Party. We have populists in France. We have populists in Germany. I think populism has been on the rise for quite some time before Donald Trump. But again, Donald Trump is like the accelerator. He makes everything go faster and bigger.
I mean, do you think that today's populism and protectionism echoes the interwar period? Everybody says, oh, this feels like 1933. Not that any of us can actually remember it, but that is the theme of discussions at the moment.
I think it does remind me a little bit, but I don't think the multilateral system in 1933 or in the 1920s, 30s was as well established as the UN framework. Now, it doesn't help that the US stops paying for a lot of these things, but they still go on. So I think that's that. We have to understand there's also been decolonization since then, a lot of decolonization. A lot of countries were still part of the British Empire or of the French Empire. Now these countries are very proud nations in their own rights. So we are in a different phase. Never has global trade been as big as it is now. But we have to be careful. We have to take care of it. And Carney had a point when he said the middle powers, because if I'm a big country, I benefit from negotiating with a small country because I'm the 300-pound gorilla. But it's harder to negotiate with the EU, who can never find consensus on anything. But it's a bigger bloc. So this unraveling works for big countries. It doesn't work for what Mark Carney calls the middle powers. But this being said, and I was in several of the talks, and actually in one of the AI talks, I asked the question when they talked how wonderful AI was and how it would make society leap forward, industry leap forward. I said, well, that's good. Are we talking about the haves and the have-nots? If I'm in Sudan and I have no access to AI, what is my future going to be? So, in other words, are we in danger of leaving huge swaths of the world's population behind? It didn't quite like the question, though.
I wonder how exposed you think Europe is to that 300-pound gorilla, to a world dominated by US tech and US defense platforms.
I think Europe is very exposed, and when I look at tech, it is really about Asia, China, and the US. And the problem that Europe has, it is still a fragmented market, right? And it also is a market where you don't really have risk capital. We don't have a venture capital industry as they have in the US. And when you go and create that next unicorn is started somewhere in a garage. So somebody needs to take a bet. So you need to have people who are willing to take the risk. What you have in the US, in China, it's more state-led. So, and then they also have, if I'm the US, that's a big market. China, that's a huge market. But Europe is theoretically a big market, but it's so fragmented. Our rules and regulations are so fragmented. And, we tend to regulate everything, which just does not always help free enterprise. I see the good in regulation, but I also see where it hinders. So, yes, it's a very good question. But in terms of tech, we are certainly very dependent. In terms of defense, too. And let us not forget, a lot of industrial pushes forward. A lot of inventions come from the defense space. Let me talk, for instance, about I used to work for many years for GE, and the GEF technology, the big gas turbines. They were essentially, in terms of turbine blading and metallurgy, a derivative of the F-16 aircraft engine. So you see, that's just an example. So many inventions in the defense space then spill over and do great things in real industry.
You talk about Europe being fragmented, and of course it is, but if it came together, could it realistically build enough capital and influence to compete?
Well, could it build enough capital? Because to build enough capital, I'm sure the capital is there, but is the risk capital there? Are the Europeans ready to take the risks? And I think Europe still is the great financial crisis. You know what happened to the southern rim of Europe? That still is. People are still very. The amount of banks that had to be bailed out and so on. There's still much more risk averse. So if they came together, yes, but they would need the risk capital, and they would need to let go of some of the regulations. I understand why we regulate big tech, right? But it doesn't help investment into big tech.
Do you think that trade wars could evolve into capital wars?
Haven't they already? Because I look at trade wars and I look at what especially Donald Trump said, well, we are giving you that many tariffs if you don't invest. And you see so many countries investing now, and companies, pharma investing in the US. So this capital war is already, or the US sucking in capital is already happening. But mind you, it already happened under Joe Biden, because he had the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. And okay, it wasn't geared towards the sectors that Trump is pivoting to. It was more towards the green economy. But I was choked and said, I'm waking up every morning to the thumping sound of capital taken out of Europe, put into the US.
Yes, yeah. I wonder if you think that nationalism could start reshaping global finance and not just supply chains, as we've seen so far.
Well, it will be difficult to do, because we do need the SWIFT system. Look what happens to countries that are cut off the SWIFT system. It is Iran, Russia, and so on. Not good for the economy. So I think everybody's sort of, this system is so interlinked, so interwoven, that I don't see us going, and the scope and the scale and the materiality that you get from having these global systems really, really help. So I don't really see that happen that much. But there may be the odd brave nationalist who wants to take himself out of the system, but that will be at the peril of the welfare of his economy or her economy.
You talked about CEOs saying Davos is so useful because you see all of these people at one time. Does it also serve a function of making people think outside their own little bubble? Because it's very easy to be sucked into just your immediate world. And do you think that CEOs underestimate political risk by operating inside that bubble, inside their own echo chambers?
I don't think it does, because we had the echo chambers. We had the Carney echo chamber. Then we had the European echo chamber. Then we had the US echo chamber. And then obviously we had AI. We had the AI echo chamber. And to me, as I said in the beginning, what was lacking was looking at the global south, because the future, the next 2 billion people that will be born on this earth until 2050, they will be born in Africa. They will be born in South Asia. And I saw way too little presence and emphasis of those nations.
I've just come back from India, and I have to say I completely agree. And when you start looking at the world through an Asian lens, it appears quite different. I wonder if when we say it's the economy, stupid, is that still true? Or are voters now driven more by identity than income?
I think it is the economy. Look at now. Trump has midterms. President Trump has midterms coming up, and his base will say, "What's the inflation? How expensive is the gasoline I'm putting in my tank? And can I pay for hospital care and so on?" So I think it still is the economy, because in the end you still have families, and not everybody's a billionaire. Very few people are billionaires. The majority of people need to make ends meet, and that's no small feat.
So if it is the economy, why do investors keep backing the US despite the political instability?
Well, I don't think they see it as a political instability. Some of it is, if you're a pharma company and you're told, if you don't invest, tariffs will go up that much. Of course you're going to invest. That's one thing. And the other thing is, it's the scope and the scale. It's a relatively free economy, so they can sell their wares with relatively, it's compared to Europe, certainly, relatively free, few boundaries. So it is still the largest economy in the world. But we should not neglect that there are other economies coming up. And in some respect, I looked at Davos and I asked myself, is this the last hooray? Is this decade the last hooray? From now to then, the last hooray of the global north.
So do you think then that pessimism could be as dangerous as complacency right now?
Oh, absolutely. Pessimism is never a good thing, and complacency. But I think I see more pessimism right now than I see complacency. When I look at countries, they're doing things. Look at Mark Carney. He's doing things. He's going out making all sorts of trade agreements with middle powers or not so middle powers. You then see, but so people are out that they're creating activity, but pessimism is a very bad thing. And also, I look at Europe. Europe is really in a tough spot, because Europe used to do well, educated population, well compensated, if not overcompensated population. The salaries are very good. But they made it go, especially in Germany, with cheap energy.
Cordelia, technology was meant to make our lives better and our economies more prosperous. Do you think that's also true? Are upside economic scenarios being ignored too easily?
I think technology is making lives more prosperous. Technology, look, AI, it will lose jobs. I mean, Jamie Dimon gave a very good speech. The CEO of JP Morgan, he gave a very good speech, or had a very good conversation, where he said, look, technology is AI. We are investing in AI, and yes, it will change the way we do business. And there will be jobs lost. There may also be jobs gained. We don't know. I always look at when we had the computer coming up, and especially so the personal computer and bigger computers in companies. A lot of people said we don't need paper anymore. Oh my, we are using more paper than we ever used, because we're still printing things out. So I think technology, we just don't know quite in which direction it goes, but it will certainly, innovation always gives a boost to the economy.
Cornelia Meyer, thank you very much for joining us here on Visionary.
Thank you very much for having me, Georgina.